Dune Part 2 is finally here, wrapping up the adaptation of the original Frank Herbert novel, and between its massive box office opening, which is the biggest since last year's Barbie, and the fact that director Denis Villeneuve has already started writing a screenplay for a third film, it seems like only a matter of time before the events of the second book, Dune Messiah, make their way to the big screen. But based on how Part 2 concluded, it would seem that the third film will deviate from the source material more than its predecessors. What should we expect from Dune Part 3? Stick around, and we will break down the events of Frank Herbert's second Dune novel, spoilers and all, to give you a vision of what happens next. But be forewarned, we're about to spoil the second Dune movie and the second Dune book, so if you'd rather be surprised, now's the time to go hide your head in the sand. Like the original novel, Dune Part 2 ends with Paul usurping the Imperial throne and wedding himself to Florence Pugh's Princess Irulan. Not all the great houses of the Landsrat are ready to recognize Paul's claim to throne, but that's where Paul's massive army of fanatical Fremen warriors comes in. Paul fears the holy war he's about to unleash, but his prescient visions lead him to believe it is necessary to ensure humanity's long-term survival. Dune Messiah picks up about 12 years after the events of Dune, after this holy war has claimed more than 60 billion lives. Paul presides over the Imperium from his throne on Arrakis, and very heavy is the head that wears the crown. Paul's spice-induced abilities have only grown since the events of the first book, and he's plagued by visions of possible futures. He finds it harder and harder to make choices or exercise free will when he can see the inevitable end result of every single action. Paul is burdened by the cataclysmic cost of his holy war, having lost full control of his fanatical army of Fremen. At the same time, Paul's prescience shows him that this holy war is not the worst outcome for humanity. His ultimate goal is to ensure that humanity flourishes rather than falls into stagnation and ruin. This process of saving humanity from itself eventually becomes known in the books as the Golden Path, and it's a burden that Paul finds increasingly hard to bear.
The first step along the Golden Path.
Meanwhile, Paul's sister Alia is now a teenager and has amassed a religious following of her own, with many Fremen worshipping her as Saint Alia of the Knife. She's intent on both unraveling the deepening conspiracy against her brother and finding a mate, not necessarily in that order. Alia appears as a 2-year-old in the original Dune novel, but Villeneuve reworked the story so that she isn't even born yet by the events of Dune Part 2. Instead, she appears solely through Paul's prescient visions, played by Anya Taylor-Joy, who will almost certainly reprise the role for Dune Part 3. Though this casting would suggest that she'll probably be portrayed as a fully mature adult rather than a hormonal teenager, which also means that the next movie will take place more than 12 years after Part 2, which is probably for the best given the sexually charged nature of some of Alia's scenes in Dune Messiah. Paul may be the Emperor in the era of Dune Messiah, but as you'd expect, not everyone is thrilled with his rule, and some Fremen have begun to question their Lisan al-Gaib. Early in the book, a group of Fremen are shown meeting on Arrakis and conspiring against Paul. They lament the loss of the old Fremen way of life. You know, being exposed to vast amounts of water on faraway planets kinda disrupts that whole desert lifestyle. Meanwhile, the book also introduces a secret cabal that's conspiring against Paul as well, which includes members of the Bene Gesserit, including both Charlotte Rampling's character, Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohayim, and Florence Pugh's Princess Irulan, the Spacing Guild, and the xenophobic sect known as the Tleilaxu. I said one of those words right, I think. Because guild navigators are so hideously transformed by spice that they bend time and space around themselves, this group is able to use them as a sort of cloaking device against Paul's prescience. In truth though, Paul knows more about the plots against him than he lets on. For example, he knows that Irulan has been secretly poisoning Chani with contraceptives. Paul refuses to consummate his marriage to Irulan, but does desire a child with Chani, who in the book is still his faithful concubine. Based on how Dune Part 2 ended, this seems like it'll be one area where the third movie will majorly differ. In any case, in the book, Paul allows Irulan to continue sabotaging Chani because his oracular visions have shown him that Chani's pregnancy will inevitably end in her death, yet he can do little to affect the future beyond delaying the outcome. When House Atreides is betrayed and massacred by the Harkonnens and their Sardaukar allies, several key characters in the book up to that point are killed off, including Master Swordsman Duncan Idaho. But it becomes increasingly clear when reading the Dune books that death is not a barrier to familiar characters returning. Case in point, Messiah features the surprise return of Duncan Idaho. Idaho is resurrected by the Tleilaxu as a Gola, an artificial silver-eyed clone implanted with the memories of the original Duncan. This version of Duncan calls himself Hate. The Tleilaxu give Hate to Paul as a gift, though Paul doesn't need prescient awareness to know that Hate is not exactly a person who can be trusted.
But Idaho is dead.
Idaho is dead.
A perfect duplicate.
Right off the bat, Hate's presence hurts Paul's standing among the Fremen. Despite their high regard for the original Duncan, they view Golas as unholy facsimiles of the real thing. Hate is also sent to seduce Alia, leading to a lot of sexual tension between the two characters, and a very good reason for making Alia an adult in the next film. The original text of Dune Messiah gives us a good idea of where things are headed in the next film, but Part 2's subtle and not so subtle differences from the first novel also strongly indicate it won't be an exact adaptation. In Messiah, Chani is depicted as Paul's concubine, still 100% loyal to the Lisan al-Gaib and desperate to conceive a child that will cement House Atreides' claim to the Imperial throne. But in Dune Part 2, Chani breaks away from Paul rather than remain by his side as the new Emperor's concubine. She's disturbed by his plan to marry into the throne and opts to return to the deserts of Arrakis. Clearly, Villeneuve has no intention of casting Zendaya's character as Paul's faithful and ever-present companion in the next movie. That's not to say that Chani will simply be out of the picture, though. We suspect that she's being positioned for a very different role in Dune Part 3, likely becoming the figurehead of those Fremen who resist Paul Muad'Dib's holy war. She's not the only one disillusioned with the supposed Messiah from another world, so we may see her leading guerrilla attacks against House Atreides' spice mining operations, kinda like she did against House Harkonnen in the second film. Conversely, we may see Irulan take on a less antagonistic role in Dune Part 3. Part 2 goes out of its way to paint Irulan as being sympathetic to Paul, which could be another clue as to the changing story direction of the next sequel. Will Irulan still be part of the Cabal plotting against the Emperor? Will Paul still be as resistant to fathering children with Irulan? And hey, what about the romance between Paul and Chani? Is that dead now, or will we see the two characters drawn back together over the course of Part 3? Is Paul still haunted by visions of Chani's death if she's really mad at him? If Dune Part 3 is going to follow the outline of Dune Messiah, eventually Chani will become pregnant, so maybe her love for Paul will win out over her commitment to the traditional Fremen way of life. We'll have to wait and see. Frank Herbert wrote 6 Dune novels, and there are 20 more after that by other authors, so clearly Dune Messiah isn't just a complete finale conclusion, but how does it wrap things up? We are about to spoil the ending, so if you don't want to know what happens in this 55-year-old book, this is your last warning. We're about to spoil it. You've had half a century and more to read it, so we're doing this. As Dune Messiah unfolds, Paul begins fighting back against the Fremen conspiracy. One of his Fedaykin loyalists, Othayim, gives Paul a dwarf servant named Bajaz, whose perfect recall gives him valuable insight into the conspiracy, but plot twist, Othayim is actually one of the Fremen traitors, and Bajaz is himself an agent of the conspiracy against Paul. Returning to his palace one day, Paul is blinded when an atomic weapon is detonated nearby. This is bad news for obvious reasons, but also because blind Fremen are expected to exile themselves into the desert rather than become a drain on their tribe's water supply, and yes, that even applies to religious figures and messiahs and all that. Paul's prescience has grown to the point, however, where he can freely move about the world and see so long as he remains in lockstep with his oracular visions, and watching their Lisan al-Gaib navigate the world with supernatural sight makes the Fremen even more in awe of Paul than ever.
They blinded my body, but not my vision.
Chani ultimately dies in childbirth as Paul's visions foretold. Bajaz implants a subconscious command in Hate to kill Paul, one that becomes activated when Paul mourns the death of Chani. However, Hate successfully resists the command, regaining full control of his memories and faculties in the process. Paul may have seen Chani's death, but he didn't foresee the fact that Chani was pregnant with twins, a boy named Leto II and a girl named Ghanima. Like Alia, the twins are born with full awareness and access to their ancestral memories. With Paul's path finally diverging from his visions, he becomes truly blind once and for all. Saitael, the Tleilaxu representative in the plot against Paul, emerges from hiding to threaten Leto and Ghanima and blackmail the now helpless Paul. Saitael demands that Paul abdicate his throne and give up his Chom Company holdings, and in return he offers to resurrect Chani as a Ghola. Paul refuses. He manages to tap into his newborn son's psychic vision, allowing him to throw a perfectly aimed knife and kill Saitael. Bajaz repeats the ultimatum, but the newly loyal Duncan executes him on Paul's command. Paul then follows Fremen tradition and retreats into the desert to die, leaving Alia and the now chastened Irulan to raise the children, and everyone lived happily ever after. Sort of.
Finally, I am free.
With this last act, Paul successfully ensures his family's future. Leto II will one day rule in his stead, and by exiling himself, Paul has broken his hold over the Fremen. He's shown them that he isn't a god, he's just another regular mortal who can be horrifically blinded by looking at atomic blasts. The galaxy enters an era of relative peace, but how long will it last? And what happens when Leto and Ghanima come of age? And where's Rebecca Ferguson's character, Lady Jessica, during all of this? Well, that's a story for another day, and that story is called Children of Dune, the 3rd book in the series, but we don't have time for that right now. And again, there's really no telling just how closely Dune Part 3 will even adapt the events of Dune Messiah. We don't know how drastically the plot's going to be affected by Chani's decision at the end of Part 2, and there's no telling what other changes Villeneuve might make in the next screenplay for the sake of making good cinema. Like Paul, we've seen the future of the Dune franchise, but that doesn't mean that future will play out exactly as we expect. What do you think? Will Dune Part 3 stick closely to the book and adapt Dune Messiah, or are there more changes in store for Paul Atreides? Let us know your wildest theories in the comments below, and for all things Dune, make sure you are following and subscribe to IGN wherever you like to watch.